Hi, this is Alex from devstories.eu. Terraform Fundamentals, Episode 3 of 13. Out of the box, the core Terraform application does not actually know how to build an Azure virtual machine or create a database. It is strictly an engine that evaluates code, determines dependencies, and manages state. To do any real work, it relies on thousands of downloadable translation plugins. This brings us to providers and how you connect your code to Azure. A common point of confusion is thinking that the Terraform application itself contains the logic for every cloud platform. It does not. The binary you install on your machine is completely infrastructure agnostic. It understands the configuration language and the deployment workflow, but it has zero hard-coded knowledge of any specific cloud API. Instead, Terraform uses plugins called providers. A provider is a standalone piece of software that understands the endpoints, authentication methods, and resource behaviors for a specific platform. There is a provider for Microsoft Azure, one for Amazon Web Services, and others for software as a service platforms like GitHub or Datadog. These plugins are published and hosted in a central directory called the Terraform registry. When you start a new infrastructure project, you must explicitly declare which providers your code will use. You also specify the exact version of the provider you want. Locking in a version is a critical practice. It ensures that if the cloud API changes or the provider plugin receives a major update tomorrow, your deployment will not unexpectedly break. You control exactly when to upgrade. Simply declaring the provider in your text file does not install it. You must run an initialization command in your terminal. This initialization step actively reaches out to the Terraform registry, downloads the required provider plugins, and caches them in a hidden local directory. Until you run this step, your Terraform project cannot interact with any external system. Let us look at setting this up for a new project connecting to an enterprise Azure subscription. You will use the official Azure Resource Manager provider, referred to as Azure RM. After declaring the version you need, you must configure the provider's specific behavior. Every provider has its own configuration requirements based on the underlying API. For Azure, the plugin requires you to explicitly declare how it should handle certain resource behaviors. For example, you must tell the provider whether it should permanently delete attached storage disks when a virtual machine is destroyed. The provider demands this configuration up front so that destructive actions are always intentional. Once initialized and configured, the provider acts as a plug-and-play translation layer. When you execute your code, the core Terraform engine calculates the difference between your current infrastructure and your desired state. It then passes those generic instructions to the Azure Provider plugin. The plugin takes over, translating your intent to authenticated HTTP requests sent directly to the Azure Resource Manager API. The plugin waits for Azure to finish creating or modifying the resources, translates the API response back into a format Terraform understands, and hands the final data back to the core engine. Terraform itself never talks to your cloud environment directly. It delegates every single API call to the provider plugin, making the provider the actual bridge between your code and your live infrastructure. That's all for this one. Thanks for listening and keep building.